Welcome to the second part of the video lecture on the Russian classics. In this video lecture, we will take a look at the most famous novella by Leo Tolstoy, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Now, before we move on to a discussion of Tolstoy and the novella, I would like to make a suggestion. I wish you would read the novella at least once, that is, if you haven't read it till now. There are many PDF versions available online, or if you would rather listen to it, there are audiobooks also available. So please read the novella or at least listen to it because it's quite short. A novella is an extended short story. It's not as long as a novel, and this novella is fairly easy also. As students of literature, I also wish that you are familiar with at least some of the classics in world literature. I know it's not a good idea to compel anyone to read, but then if you are familiar with the classics, it will certainly be helpful to you. It is not very easy to sit and read a huge novel. So maybe if you are not into the habit of reading, maybe you could start by reading interesting stories like the Arabian Nights, for instance, or short stories by Anton Chekhov, or any other short story that you would prefer. And there are very simple translations of the classics also. For example, the Iliad by Homer. If you can't sit and read through it fully, at least skim through it so that you will get an idea of how the classics have been composed. Again, if you need some inspiration to read the classics, maybe you can read books that contain reviews about the great classics, or you can visit sites like blog.oup.com where they give you a short introduction to some of the most famous classics in world literature. This is a book that I often refer to, 100 Great Books, Masterpieces of All Time, edited by John Canning. Now, this is a wonderful reference book and I often read it. I hope you will also make use of such sources that will inspire you to read a classic. Count Leo Tolstoy was born on 9th September 1828 in Russia. He was born in a very wealthy, aristocratic family, but he was orphaned at a very young age. Tolstoy did not complete his university education. He served in the military for a few years. After marriage to Sofia in 1862, Tolstoy started living in the family estate where he wrote his two greatest literary masterpieces, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Tolstoy was a master of realistic fiction. Now, realistic fiction is a fictional genre in which stories and characters resemble real life. War and Peace he started writing War and Peace when he was only 35 years old. This novel captured the vast panorama of life during Napoleon's brutal invasion of Russia. Usually, the novels we read portray only a very small slice of life with a handful of characters. This extraordinary novel is so huge. It contains 7 lakh words and about 539 characters. Uh, War and Peace portrays scenes of battle with violence as well as everyday scenes. And Tolstoy seems to point out the fact that life is bigger than any of us. Now, this is a quote from the novel. I have included it here because this quote talks about man's fear of death and also about the value of suffering, two things that are important to note when we discuss the novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. The second greatest masterpiece of Tolstoy, Anna Karenina, is a very beautiful portrait of a woman for whom love is more important than the network of social relationships and moral values that bind the society around her. In Anna Karenina, Tolstoy says that the search for happiness should take on a deeper philosophical significance. Now, it is said that after the publication of Anna Karenina, Tolstoy fell into a deep state of depression. Everything seemed absurd, so he turned to religion for comfort. He was a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, but he was soon disillusioned with the corruption of the church. He concluded that all churches give a false version of Christianity. So Tolstoy developed his own faith and his own beliefs based on the message of Jesus Christ. His profound existential crisis was mainly because of his paralyzing fear of death. Having overcome that fear, Tolstoy was transformed into a new person. He was excommunicated from the church in 1901 because he propagated his new and radical faith. The Death of Ivan Ilyich was published in 1886. It was written shortly after his spiritual transformation. Now, this work is one of the finest examples of the novella genre. A novella, as I said earlier, is like an extended short story. It is well structured and compact, and the narrative is often realistic and satiric in tone. A novella is characterized by brevity and self contained plots that mostly end on a note of irony and employs an objective rather than a subjective narration. The Death of Ivan Ilyich portrays a dying man's slow and painful realization that he has wasted his whole life pursuing trivial things. The novella examines a life not well lived and the consequences of it. The Death of Ivan Ilyich is considered as a masterpiece of psychological realism. Now, psychological realism is a literary method. It is used by authors to focus on the inner thoughts and motivations of the characters instead of simply narrating a story. This mode of narration examines the reasons for the behaviors of the characters which propel the plot and explain the story. Some of the narrative modes employed in psychological realism include stream of consciousness, internal monologues, and flashback. Now, these are the main characters in the novel. Ivan Ilyich, the protagonist, he is 45 years old. He is a magistrate. He is well known and very influential in society. Praskovia is Ivan's wife. Gerasim, Ivan's servant. Lisa and Vazia or Vladimir, the children of Ivan. Peter or Pyotr Ivanovich, and Schwartz, Ivan's friends and colleagues. The novella has 12 chapters or 12 sections. The story is deceptively simple. We will go through the sections. We will go through a very brief overview of the sections. Now, the opening chapter is very important. It begins with the announcement of the death of Ivan Ilyich. The date is 4th February 1882. It was his friend Peter or Piotr who came across the news in the obituary column of a newspaper. So immediately he shares it with his colleagues. This news elicits mixed reactions. They express sorrow, but when Tolstoy shows us what is going on in their minds, we understand that they are only thinking about how they will benefit from his death. An influential post in the court is now vacant. So they are thinking whether they will get that post, whether they will get a promotion. Tolstoy also mentions that Ivan was liked by them all. But as the chapter unfolds, we understand that this is a satiric statement. Nobody really liked Ivan, and so his death did not affect any of them. Instead, each one of them thought happily, it was he who died and not I. Now, we see that Peter decides to attend the funeral only because he is the only person who has known Ivan from childhood. They studied law together, and so he feels obliged to attend the funeral to see the family and pay his respects. Now, when he goes there, Tolstoy gives us a brief glimpse of the members of Ivan's family. Ivan's wife, Praskovia, seems to be more concerned about the money she will get as Ivan's pension. Peter is also slightly taken aback when he sees the dead man's face. He observes that it was more handsome and more dignified than when he was alive. Peter also notices that the expression signified that Ivan had fulfilled everything in life. It also seemed to convey a warning to the living. Now, when the chapter ends, we see Peter uh, deciding not to attend the funeral. Instead, he goes to play a game of cards with his friends. Now, another character is also shown in the first chapter, Schwartz. He is also a colleague of Ivan. Now, Schwartz is a very cheerful person. It is he who tells Peter that instead of attending the funeral, it is better to have some fun by playing a game of cards. Now, what does Tolstoy wish to convey in the opening chapter? There are two things to think about, to reflect on. The first is the question, how do people view death? Tolstoy wishes to show us this is how people react to the news of the death of a person. Human beings in general, they do not want to acknowledge death as the only moment of truth in life. They think that death is somewhere in the future. They don't want to confront death. And the second thing is, Tolstoy asks, how does death make the life of a person trivial? If you look at the impact of the news of Ivan's death, the impact that it had on the colleagues, they weren't even bothered by the fact that Ivan is no more. They were only thinking about their own lives. So, whatever Ivan achieved in life has been made trivial by his death. So, the story of the novella has actually been told in the opening chapter itself. There is nothing else left to see. Now, what follows is how death itself, or how this realization that he will die, had a life changing effect on Ivan, leading to a spiritual transformation on his deathbed. In the second and third sections, we get a picture of Ivan's early life, his education, his career, and marriage. The second section begins with a very important statement that has been much discussed in world literature. It states, Ivan Illich's life had been most simple and most ordinary, and therefore most terrible. Now we'll come to a discussion of this sentence later on. These chapters describe his happy childhood. He was the pride of his family because he was a hardworking person. He was intelligent, he was lively, he was very pleasant, and he was considered a very decent individual. After his education, he got a very good job that secured him a place in the upper class circles. Now, right from childhood, Ivan had always been very ambitious, and his aspirations were to become a wealthy and a well known person in society. He lived only to fulfill societal expectations. For example, the marriage. He married just to acquire a wife and do something that was considered right by society. In reality, the marriage was very unpleasant and unhappy to both of them. And Ivan was more only interested in his career. He immersed himself in his official duties rather than spending time with his wife and children. Now, in chapter 3, we find that 17 years of the marriage has passed, and Ivan is going through a very difficult phase in his life. He was in a deep state of depression. The reason was that he was being denied promotions to higher posts by his boss. He had an argument with the boss, and so his life was terrible. But instead of wallowing in grief, Ivan was a very strong person. So he set out to find a better, highly paid job, which he finally got with the help of Peter. So this made him very happy, and he was planning to move with his family to the new place. So he found a beautiful home, and one day while he was trying to show someone how to drape the curtains, he climbed a ladder, he missed a step, and he fell down. The only thing was that happened was that he knocked his side on the knob of a window frame. So he didn't give much importance to it. He just ignored the pain. Now, from chapter 4 onwards, we understand that the pain was the beginning of a strange illness. He got a strange taste in his mouth that never left. Then the pain started increasing. His physical health soon deteriorates, and he consults many celebrated doctors who unfortunately are unable to diagnose the illness properly. They give him many medication, many medicines, but no medicine can take away the pain. As a result, Ivan's behavior also changes. He is always irritated and angry at home and also in the office. Now, chapter 5 again tells us that Ivan slowly started thinking about death. He was he felt very terrible and he feels the presence of death. From chapter 6 onwards, we have reached the middle of the novella. There are only 12, 12 chapters in total. So, from chapter 6, we find that the pain gets worse and he strongly feels the presence of death. This is what the novella says. In the depths of his soul, Ivan Ilyich knew that he was dying, but not only was he not accustomed to it, he simply did not, he could not possibly understand it. So, this Tolstoy conveys is the general human nature. Even when you know that you are going to die, you find it very difficult to understand. So, we find that the pain and suffering gets worse day by day. But what disturbed him very much was the indifferent attitude shown by his wife and daughter. In front of him, they pretended that he is okay. They ignored his pain, they ignored his suffering, and this deception tortured him. Only Gerazim, the servant, volunteered to take care of Ivan. He was a great source of physical comfort and emotional support. His young son Vasya is also very kind to him. The next two chapters give a graphic description of the mental and the physical torment. Now, Ivan has reached a stage where he dislikes the presence of other people around him, except Gerazim. He hates his wife, he hates his daughter, he's terribly irritated by their presence. So he tried to find comfort in solitude. Again, he also tried in vain to replace his fearful thoughts of death with good and happy memories. He tries to take refuge in his nostalgic memories and he realizes that the only happy memories that he has is fond memories of his childhood. The final chapter, or the final section, deals with Ivan's suffering. Preskovia mentions in the opening chapter, when she talks to Peter, she says that Ivan was continuously screaming for the last 3 days of his life. So, for 3 days, he was haunted by dreams of a black sack. He dreamt that he was being pushed into a black sack by some invisible force. And this chapter focuses on the value of suffering and the gradual realization of the value of leading a good life. When after a while the desire to live slowly faded from Ivan's mind, he was able to overcome the fear of death. Ivan finally realizes the insignificance and the fragility of human existence. He embraces death very peacefully. Before he died, it is said that he said to his soul, "Death is finished, it is no more." So, the death of Ivan Ilyich gives us valuable insights by reflecting on the meaning of life and death. The novella explores Tolstoy's view that people lead shallow, unhappy lives in order to fulfill the expectations of society. Ivan's sufferings actually mirror Tolstoy's own intellectual and spiritual struggles. Remember, this novella was composed when immediately after he went through a kind of spiritual crisis in his life. So the death of Ivan Ilyich elucidates Tolstoy's religious beliefs and his views on leading an authentic Christian life. Now let's take a look at the characters of the novella. Ivan, this is a very common Russian name. It is a variant of the English name John. Ivan means God is gracious. So he is the protagonist of the novella. As we've already discussed, he is a wealthy, successful magistrate. He was always ambitious and he died at the age of 45. Now, 45 is not a very old age to die. Tolstoy says that Ivan Ilyich's life had been most simple and most ordinary and therefore most terrible. So, why did he say that Ivan lived a terrible life? Terrible probably refers to the fact that Ivan's life was devoid, it was empty of spiritual and moral values. He simply followed the dictates of society and was strongly influenced by upper class manners and ways of life. So, he did not actually live an authentic life, a life free to lead on his own terms. And again, because he was so much interested in his career and promotions, he was always immersed in official duties. And Ivan failed to maintain meaningful relationships with his family, friends, and colleagues. The fatal illness finally revealed to him that his life was not the real thing. In chapter 11, we find Ivan asking himself a very pertinent question: what if my whole life has been wrong? So, through the character of Ivan, Tolstoy serves to remind readers to reflect on their lives. Gerasim is the second most important character of the novella. He was a young peasant. He served as the servant, but he was very gentle, he was wise and kind. Now, Gerasim was the only person who was cheerful and bright in Ivan's home. He empathizes with Ivan, and he was the only source of physical comfort and emotional support. He volunteers to stay with him throughout till the very end. Now, Gerazim is portrayed as a symbol of Christian goodness. He's almost like the Good Samaritan mentioned in the Bible. Now, the Good Samaritan, according to the parable, is a person who helps a complete stranger to recover from his wounds. So, Gerazim is actually a complete stranger to Ivan, but he was the only one who offered to look after him and and who was a great source of comfort to Ivan till he dies. Now, in Garazim's life, he was always aware that death will come for everyone someday. Praskovia, the wife of Ivan, was a very selfish character. She was only interested in leading a very luxurious life. And we see that she was always spending money on luxuries. She was also a hypocrite. In front of Ivan, she pretended to be very loving and caring, but actually, she was not that. And towards the end, we see her getting really irritated and annoyed, as if Ivan was at fault for falling ill. She was very unsympathetic and indifferent. And before the funeral, we see her questioning Peter about the money that she will receive, about Ivan's pension, and so on. Vasya is Ivan's innocent young son, an immature boy. Unlike his mother and sister Lisa, Vasya is very sympathetic to Ivan's suffering. He doesn't really understand much, but he shows compassion and kindness. Vasya is a symbol of hope for the future. Peter Ivanovich. Now, Peter was Ivan's close friend. He was his childhood friend, and later they were college mates. And then he was also responsible for Ivan securing a very good job. Peter represents Ivan's social milieu, the social milieu that Ivan was trying so hard to fit in by imitating the upper middle class or the upper class manners and ways of life. Now we find that Peter is also not not a very good friend, because instead of attending the funeral, he would rather forget about Ivan's death by going to have some fun, by spending some time with his friends. Schwartz is Ivan's colleague. He is portrayed as well dressed, very lively, very playful. He is a person who ignores life's unpleasantness. Schwarz is a German name, it means black color, and maybe it refers to the Tolstoyan belief in the hollowness of a light-hearted attitude towards life. Now, let us take a look at the themes of the novel. The central theme of the novel is death or mortality. So, Tolstoy highlights this theme, the inevitability of death. Now, we find that people are often afraid of death. So, this novella is a realistic portrayal of man's instinct to understand the meaning of life only when faced with the inevitability of death. This reflects Tolstoy's deep faith in the Christian religion. Ivan's life has been made trivial by his death because he did not make the right choices in life. Tolstoy emphasizes that death is the most important moment of truth. And for Ivan, death becomes a kind of spiritual rebirth. Towards the end, we find that Ivan overcomes his fears of death and dies peacefully and joyfully. Death is finished, it is no more. These are Ivan's last words. These words echo the last words of Jesus Christ before he died on the cross. Jesus said, "It is finished." Means that he has completed his mission on earth. So, probably Ivan was also referring to that. The second theme is the theme of the illusion of reality. So Tolstoy points out that people live under the illusion of reality, that life simply goes on. They don't care about it. They refuse to acknowledge that death is somewhere lurking in the corner. Ivan also had never given the inevitability of death so much as a passing thought. It never crossed his mind that one day he will also die. And what happens is, one day death comes into his life unannounced, in the form of a very strange, a painful, and an incurable illness. But even then, Ivan refuses to acknowledge the reality of death till his last moments. So, this illusion of reality is also carried forward by the people around Ivan. His family and his colleagues pretend that there is nothing wrong with Ivan. His wife and daughter just ignore his pain and sufferings, and Ivan was tortured by this deception. Even the celebrated doctors carried show this kind of an illusion of reality. They gave Ivan false hopes by telling him that all you need is to take this medicine and you will be all right. So Tolstoy says that as long as people refuse to face the reality of death, they live under the illusion of reality. The next theme is conflict between worldly or materialistic and spiritual life. The novella reflects the attitude of most human beings towards life and death. In the case of Ivan, he had completely ignored the spiritual aspects and chased after worldly pleasures. It was only during his illness and towards the end of his life that he becomes aware of the importance of the spiritual aspects in life. This awareness finally enables him to overcome the fear of death and to die peacefully and happily. Now, this conflict is also symbolized in the image of the black sack. During the towards the end of his life, he was haunted by dreams of this black sack, a sack into which he felt somebody was pushing him, and the more he resisted, uh, the more the more intense his pain became. And so, the black sack represents death, which Ivan was not willing to accept. He wanted to go back to his worldly life. He did not want to let go of life. Sin and redemption. This is a theme which is based on the Christian beliefs. The doctrine of sin and redemption is central to Christianity. Now, Tolstoy wrote this novella after going through a spiritual crisis, and he had a deep faith in the Christian religion. Now, in Christianity, it is said that everybody who is born is a sinner. Nobody is perfect. Everyone is born a sinner. Sin is inherent in mankind. Only God can forgive sins, but man has to pray, confess his sins, and pray for forgiveness. Now, on his deathbed, Ivan also asks his son and God to forgive his sins. This confession of guilt and acceptance of death finally redeems him, and he is able to die peacefully and happily. So we move on to the symbols in the novella. The first symbol is the black sack. This is a very important symbol. The black sack represents death. Ivan is haunted by dreams of falling into a black sack. Resistance to entering the black sack reveals the conflict between love for material life and the fear of death. And finally, only when he stopped resisting and allowed himself to fall into the black sack was he able to embrace death and find happiness. It is said that it is described in the novella that when he falls into the deep black hole, he sees a light at the end. Now, the black sack also symbolizes rebirth in its likeness to a womb. The next symbol is the phoenix. Now, a phoenix is a unique bird in classical mythology. After its time, it burns itself and rises from the ashes with renewed youth to live through another cycle. So Ivan is the phoenix of his family, and there are many instances where he, when he thought that he will not succeed, instead of wallowing in despair, he rises. So in Christianity, sometimes a phoenix is used to symbolize the resurrection or a kind of rebirth, and it may also signify Ivan's final victory in overcoming his fear of death and evolving into a spiritual being. Now, the novella also uses many motifs. The most important is suffering. Suffering is a Christian motif, and in Christianity, it has great value. From chapter 6 to the end, we are given a graphic description of Ivan's physical as well as mental suffering because of intense, unbearable pain. Now, illness is also another motive because right from the beginning, the first till the end, we are made aware that Ivan has contracted a very strange and incurable illness. Selfishness is another motive. Uh, a motive is a recurrent idea that you find repeated in a novel or a literary work. So, selfishness is also found throughout the novella. Most of the characters are motivated by selfish interests. Ivan's wife, Praskovia, his colleagues, all of them are very selfish. Alienation is another motive. Uh, Ivan alienates himself from the rest of the world. Though he has many friends, he moves around in a very pleasant circle. He doesn't really have any attachment to any of them, and he is also alienated from his family. And towards the end, physical and emotional isolation is experienced by Ivan. So these are some of the most important things to study when you are going through this novella. To conclude, the death of Ivan Ilyich portrays existential fear of disease and death, while describing life as a web of lies intended to distract people from the inevitability of death. So Tolstoy wishes to emphasize this point that death is inevitable. Death is the only moment of truth. Death is the only reality in a person's life. The novella proves that Tolstoy was not just one of the greatest writers who ever lived, but a living symbol of the search for life's meaning. Matthew Arnold has observed that a novel by Tolstoy is not a work of art, but a piece of life. I hope you were able to understand this video lecture clearly. And I have included some questions also. These are usually asked. Characters of Gerasim, Schwartz, Praskovia, Peter Ivanovich. These questions can be asked. Themes, symbols, motives. These are also probable questions. And essay questions like, how does Tolstoy portray the pettiness of human beings in the novella? Um, then Matthew Arnold's comment with regard to Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. So thank you so much for listening to this video lecture. I hope you do well in your exams, in your examinations. These are some of the references. The first reference, it is actually a PDF version that I have used to prepare this video lecture. And thank you very much once again. Good luck.